of religious liberty. And religious liberty is dear to my heart because that's what I do as a full-time lawyer. I work for Alliance Defending Freedom, and we litigate cases defending free speech, religious liberty, marriage and family, parental rights, and the right to life. But the mission statement of ADF is not to win cases that protect life and protect religious liberty. Our mission statement is to keep the doors open for the spread of the gospel. So last time when we talked about religious liberty, we talked about the importance of teaching our family members and our friends why we value religious liberty in this country, everything that it brings for us. And today I want to talk about how we exercise that religious liberty in the public square. If the doors are open for spreading the gospel, how are we supposed to do that? And I want to start with a wonderful example, a hero of mine, St. Thomas More. Hopefully most of you have heard of him. He is the patron saint of lawyers. And there's a prayer that I actually have of his hanging in my office. And this is a prayer that he had to Jesus Christ. Pray for me and with me, that my family may find in me what your family found in you. Friendship and courage, cheerfulness and charity, diligence in duties, counsel in adversity, patience in pain. They are good servant, but God's first. So he understood that to be a good Catholic servant, he needed to be there for his family and his friends, but God before everything else, even if that meant personal reprobation for him. And so what defined St. Thomas More was in his legal career, he was serving King Henry VIII. And King Henry VIII asked him as his chancellor to annul his marriage. And there were no grounds for an annulment, and Thomas More refused to do that. And so Henry VIII got upset about that. The Pope wouldn't give him the annulment because of Thomas More's refusal to say that it was a valid annulment. And so what he did is he created a Church of England, declared himself to be the head of it, and he was just going to grant his own annulment. And so he asked his chancellor, Thomas More, like he did all of his citizens, to take an oath recognizing that he, King Henry VIII, was the head of the Anglican Church. It was an act of supremacy, a law that required everyone to sign this. And it was treason if he refused. And so, of course, now Thomas More was presented with a huge dilemma. Would he abide by this unjust law, or would he commit treason and be subject to execution? And his family members and his friends really wanted him to just sign the piece of paper. His wife begged him to sign the piece of paper rather than give up his life. And there were good reasons why he might have given up his principles and just signed it, because he was doing a lot of good as chancellor, and he was teaching a lot of people about the Catholic faith. If he was executed, he couldn't continue to do those things. And yet, he wouldn't do it, because he understood that it was more than just a piece of paper. It was his fidelity to a law, and that law was unjust. He recognized that all laws have to be rooted in transcendent, real, and objective truth and justice. It had to be God's truth, or otherwise it wasn't a valid law. And this was not, and so he couldn't swear fidelity to it. And as a result, he was found liable for treason, and he was beheaded. And he's revered today as the patron saint of lawyers. Henry VIII and his many wives are remembered mostly because of that Herman's Hermit song from the 1960s. I'm Henry VIII, I am. So there's two lessons that I want you to take from this story. First is that sin, including following the law, but committing sin, has consequences. King Henry VIII's acts to get that annulment that he wanted, contrary to the teachings of the church, fueled the Reformation. Now you might remember how the Reformation started with Martin Luther. He was a Catholic priest, and he posted the 95 Theses on the door. And in response to that, there was some dialogue, and there was a counter-reformation in the Catholic Church to respond to some of the constructive criticisms in that list. But by and large, there wasn't a surge of Protestantism after Martin Luther posted those theses. It was because King Henry VIII, the leader of one of the most wealthy and powerful countries on earth, broke from the Catholic Church and founded the Anglican Church that gave the Reformation all the wind behind its sails. All because the king was rebelling against Jesus' teaching that marriage is indissoluble. So imagine, instead of, if it wasn't just Thomas More, but if it was everybody in England, if everybody had stood up and said, no, we're not going to sign that illegal oath because there's only one true church, that's the Catholic Church, sought the repeal of that Supremacy Act and replaced the king, They could have stopped the Reformation in its tracks. And here we stand hundreds of years later with all the division in the Christian church writ large, and it's because Catholics failed to stand up as individuals and do what Thomas More did, which was to resist an unjust law that broke God's law. So that's lesson number one. Number two is that we have a personal duty to stand up to all laws and all actions that aren't rooted in that transcendent objective truth and justice. Now, it's unlikely for us that it's going to result in our death. We know Catholic brothers and sisters around the world where that actually is a choice between their faith and death, in the Middle East, in Nigeria, many other places. Here, it's highly unlikely that we're going to experience death for acting out on our faith. It's unlikely that we'll even be stopped from conducting our church activities. It's not like Michigan or federal government authorities are rushing in to stop our mass. Officials may mock the Eucharist, we've seen that. They may say terrible things about Catholics and our prayers, but they're probably not going to interfere with our religious practice. However, it's happening every single day in this state and this country that officials and large corporations are pushing laws and policies that are really conflicting with a Catholic individual's ability to live out their faith in the public square. And it makes me think of the Bible passage about the two sons whose father wanted them to work in the vineyard. And there was one son, and he said that he would work in the vineyard, and then he didn't. And then the other son said that he wouldn't work in the vineyard, and then he did. And he asked, well, which one of those was actually doing his father's will? It's the one who went out into the vineyard and did the work. And sometimes it's easy for us to say, wow, I really want to do my father's work. But when it comes to difficult subjects like abortion, like same-sex marriage, like gender ideology, like pornography, it's easier just to give in than to resist, to say, yes, God, I know those things are important, but the cost is just too high. Or you've got me doing these other things and I'm just too busy. But we've got to take these things seriously, and when the moments present themselves, stand up for what God is teaching us, stand up for the truth in the same way Thomas More did. And so I'm just going to touch on three ways that we can do that. Now, the first is in the context of abortion. And the Knights, as you know, collectively do a tremendous job pushing a pro-life agenda. When Proposition 3 was out there, the Knights and the Catholic Church were all united in public advocacy, trying to fight against Prop 3. All the wonderful work that we do at the pregnancy centers. You heard this weekend about the 100th ultrasound machine that was purchased. But now that this law is the law of Michigan, there's so much more that we need to do. Are you and your councils going and praying at 40 Days for Life? Are you still participating in the March for Life in Washington, D.C.? And if not there, how about the March for Life right here in Michigan? If you didn't know, they're holding one annually in Lansing where we march around the Capitol every single year. All of our councils should be there. Are you taking the time in your family to teach your children and your grandchildren about the importance of life, the dignity of every human person beginning at conception? When you hear someone say, it's my body, my choice, do you respond, no, it's not your body. It's the body of a unique individual who has their own DNA, it has their own blood type, and is going to grow up and be someone spectacular because God created them in His image and likeness. Do you work at the local pregnancy center? Do you volunteer at a baby pantry at your local parish? There are so many ways that we can participate in supporting life, which is part of God's plan. And if we don't do it, no one else is going to be doing it. 63 million babies have been aborted in the United States since Roe versus Wade. We just heard that more than 30,000 babies were aborted in Michigan just in the past year. And we're not even going to know what that number is going forward anymore because the state of Michigan has repealed the requirement that abortion clinics report when they commit abortions. And so we need to be out there. We need to be advocates every single day to make sure that we're protecting life. So how about same-sex marriage and gender ideology? This could be an even more difficult subject because many of us likely have individuals in our family or close friends who have same-sex attractions, who maybe are experiencing gender dysphoria. And when it comes to our employers, this is where the laws and the rules really tend to get pushed. If you're at a large corporation, there's a strong possibility that the DEI folks in the Human Resources Department are asking you to wear an ally pin during June, to use preferred pronouns for individuals who identify as a sex different than their gender, and to violate your faith in other ways. Those are moments as Catholics when we have to stand up. And if you think this is just a hypothetical, there's a knight in this room who had experienced this very problem at his large corporation employer. They wanted him to sign a document and treat a transgender employee in accordance with their subjective profession of their gender instead of their sex. And he said, no, I'll lose my job before I will compromise my Catholic principles. It was a Thomas More moment, and he stepped up to it. And what's, yes, exactly. And what's even more remarkable about that is that all the other individuals that he worked with stood up to support him and said that they would walk out too if he was fired. Now, how is that as a way of exhibiting and modeling what it means to be a Catholic in the public square? It's absolutely remarkable. But there are many other opportunities for the state and for government or for corporations to impose on our Catholic religious beliefs in this area. You may not realize this, but our Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act in Michigan has been amended to include sexual orientation and gender identity protections, and there is nothing in that law that provides any religious accommodation, not even for churches or for Catholic schools. One of the cases that we have at Alliance Defending Freedom is on behalf of Sacred Heart, a Catholic school in Grand Rapids, which realized that they would have to violate Catholic precepts just to be able to operate. If they took St. John Paul II's theology of the body, his beautiful statement about the meaning of human sexuality and the meaning of marriage, and they put it on their website, that would violate the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Law. But they were willing to stand up too. We went to court, and we just got an injunction against the state of Michigan so it could not enforce its unjust laws against that Catholic school. And there are going to be... There are going to be many, many other opportunities for us to push back on things like that. And so again, just like with the pro-life issues, are you talking to your kids and to your grandchildren about what it means to be human in the Catholic understanding? Do you know John Paul II's theology of the body? That we are not embodied souls, that we are not just souls trapped in some shell, but instead that we are embodied souls, and that our body says something about who we are, that my male body tells you something about who I am as a man, and that when we divorce ourselves from that body, that we're rejecting God's gift, and we're also rejecting our authentic selves in a way that we can't love our neighbor, we can't be in an authentic relationship. We need to be teaching our families these principles. The last thing that I want to talk about is pornography. And this is an untalked about scourge of our society right now. You think about what pornography does. It objectifies women and sometimes men, turns them into simple objects. And when we do that, we don't respect them with the kind of dignity and respect that they're entitled to as sons and daughters of God. And when you have teenagers or adults who are looking at pornography, self-gratifying themselves in their own bedrooms, again, they're not entering into authentic relationships. They're not pursuing that challenge of being open to another person and then truly loving them the way the Catholic Church calls us to do. And when I say love, I mean willing the good of the other, not some emotional, mushy feeling, but actually willing the good of someone else. Instead, they're just getting all their pleasure in their room by themselves. And so years ago, Pope Paul VI in Humana Vitae, when he was talking about contraception and why Catholics can't ever use contraception because that destroys the meaning of sex, pornography is of a piece with that. You know, what Pope Paul VI said about contraception is that if the Catholic Church lost the contraception battle around the world, what we would see are more abortions, more divorce, more objectification of women, more sexual harassment and assault, and a de-dignifying of the human person. And I can't imagine a more prophetic statement that's been made, because now we've seen all those sins and all those evils come to fruition here in the 21st century, and pornography is perpetuating all those things. Now, there are some states, like Texas, which are trying to keep at least young people away from pornography. They've got a law that requires an age verification before a minor is able to access a pornographic website, and it keeps them off of that. That case is going to be heard in the U.S. Supreme Court this term because a number of pornography sites, represented by the ACLU, are arguing that violates rights to free speech, if you can imagine that. We talk about an unjust use of our First Amendment's free speech clause. And so I would ask you to pray for those justices, that they reach the right decision in that case. Pray for government officials at the national level and at the state level to restrict and hopefully eliminate pornography from our culture. But again, as men and women, as moms and dads, as grandparents in our families, it's our responsibility to stop the scourge of pornography in our own families. Make sure that you've got protection on your kids' and grandkids' phones. Talk to them about the dignity of the human person and make sure they understand how evil it is to objectify women and men in the way that pornography does. And these are difficult conversations to have, to talk to your teenagers about what life means, about what human sexuality means, about what pornography is and why we should avoid it. Now, these are our challenges. And sometimes it means that we're going to have job security on the line. Sometimes it means it'll be reputations in our family, among our friends, and things like that. Sometimes it'll be facing spiritual warfare, which is why we say the prayer to St. Michael. But God will always be there to protect and provide in those moments when we're standing up to these cultural evils and following His law instead of the law of man. And my prayer for all of you is that you'll be able to walk courageously in the church's teaching, to work in that vineyard with perseverance, patience, diligence, and compassion, so that, like Thomas More, you can be your family and community's servant, but be God's first. So, God bless you.